Now, today we have Gray from Madison Street Strategies and Miles, Amy, and Rick from Cardno. I'm going to let them introduce themselves as part of their presentation. So, Gray, if you don't mind, I'll turn the stage over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Fred, for having us today. I'm really excited to talk about opportunity zones. Tyler, I think you're progressing slides. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next one? I might have a Okay, so my name is Gray Dodge. I am a partner at Madison Street Strategies. We are a consulting group mainly focused on economic development, and our primary focus is opportunity zones, how they intersect with other programs, how local governments can use opportunity zones to the best of their ability. So as I mentioned, we work on economic development finance projects for economic development projects around the Southeast. My background, I've spent some time in the state with DBPR, DEO for the last few years as policy director there, brief stints in the House and in the Senate at a state level. Started Madison Street just earlier this year when Governor Scott termed out office, and we left the state and launched our company. So we are getting the ball rolling, and let's go forward and talk about opportunity zones. This presentation is really meant to be we're going to start at high level, get everybody on the same playing field. What is opportunity zones? How were these created? Give you some brief background, and then really get into some more of the bulk before I turn it over to the folks at Cardno, who will get more into brownfields and maybe how these programs can intersect. So Tyler, if you would, next slide. Okay. Oh, back one. Sorry, you'd already changed it. Okay. So opportunity zones, these were created in December 2017 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The federal legislation allowed the governor of each state to nominate 25% of their low-income census tracts as opportunity zones. So where that left us nationally is over 8,700 zones across the entire country. You can see it in that map in the bottom left quadrant. And in the state of Florida, what that left us with is 427 designated opportunity zones, and that was from a starting point of 1,706 eligible low-income census tracts. So as I mentioned, that was our starting point, and we were allowed to choose 25% of those, which I'll walk through what that process looked like. That left us at our 427 that we currently have. Next slide, please. So what are these? These are low-income census tracts. This is not a state designation. This is a U.S. Census Bureau designation. We were really given the criteria from the federal government which tracts even qualified to begin with. That was the starting point for the state's analysis. So we were given that list of 1,706 that I just mentioned, and then we were allowed to really, it was a flexible process. We were allowed to choose our zones kind of however we saw fit, and I'll talk more about that process. But the whole policy perspective for this program is to encourage long-term investment in low-income communities. It was really able to get bipartisan support by, one, creating a tax break for wealthy individuals, but only if they invest in these low-income communities that are so desperate for investment. So that's how it really got broad support across the aisle. And the whole idea here is that reinvesting unrealized capital gains into opportunity funds provides a tax incentive to the investor, and we'll break down what that means in just a minute. Next slide. So again, this is very high level, simple as we can make it. Capital gains put into an opportunity fund itself. That is just the funding mechanism. That fund then has to hold 90% of its assets in either opportunity zone property or opportunity zone business. Operating businesses. In doing so, investing in those gives a tax benefit for those capital gains dollars. Next slide. So what are the tax benefits? There are three. Number three is the most exciting, but we'll start at the beginning. So the first is a temporary deferral. So if you realize capital gains today and put them into an opportunity fund within 180 days, then you are deferring paying the capital gains tax on those capital gains dollars until 2026. They're deferred, and so really your tax event is 2027. But you're deferring paying capital gains on those dollars that you realize today and put into a fund. A lot of people compare this to maybe a 1031 or something like that. The difference here, let's say you realize $5 million in capital gains For the Opportunity Zone program, you don't have to put all $5 million into a new investment. You can put $1 million, you can put $500,000. It doesn't really matter, but you're only deferring tax on that amount that you put into an opportunity fund. So at the next benefit, we've already lost part of this. So the next benefit is a step up in basis. So after holding your investment, and these are meant to be long-term investments, so after holding your investment in the Opportunity Fund, which is investing in the property or the business that's located in the Opportunity Zone, after 5 years, you get a 10% step up in basis. After 7 years, a 15% step up in basis. Now, why I said we've already lost one of these, if you do the math, the 5-year hold, because your tax event's 2026, we've now lost the 7-year hold, that 15% step up. So the last time to invest and be able to get that 7-year hold was by the end of 2019. So you can still get the 10% step up after 5 years. You just lose that additional 5% bonus for holding an extra 2 years. But again, we've already always told folks that we talk to that that extra 5% step up is not worth rushing into an investment. As people are looking at putting their money into opportunity funds last year, generally we encourage them not to rush into something that they didn't really do their due diligence on just for a 5% step up. So really number 3 is the big kicker here. This is what most folks are interested in, is a permanent exclusion of capital gains tax. So investments that are held in an opportunity fund and then in property for 10 years or more, you'll pay no capital gains tax on the post-acquisition gains. So your $1 million that you put into a fund, this is as simple as I can make it, $1 million in unrealized gain or in realized gains you put into a fund today. 10 years from now, that $1 million is worth $5 million. Well, you've got your 10% step up in basis, so you're paying taxes on $900,000 in capital gains 10 years from now on a $5 million property. So that's really what most folks are excited about. A lot of them obviously excited about real estate. That's where most of the attention is, but you're getting a lot of venture capital firms interested in more operating businesses, which we'll discuss in just a few minutes, and really because they're looking for that unicorn investment. How can they put capital gains into a startup located in a zone that, in 10 years from now is going to be the next Google or Uber or Lyft or something like that, or Tesla. Next slide, please, Tyler. So opportunity funds, as I've mentioned, these are a legal entity. That's why they need to be mentioned. But it's as simple as an LLC or a corporation. Anybody in this room or any room can go start a opportunity fund if they would like to. There's no requirements on fund size or scope. So really we're seeing funds that are, I think the largest that's been announced was $2.5 billion. And some funds you'll never even hear of because they're a single project fund and they're going to raise $100,000 or $200,000 for a single property, a small property in an opportunity zone. So there's really no requirements on what this looks like. Obviously, much more complex when you're talking about those $2 billion funds. You're looking at accredited investors and bringing the SEC into the mix. So it gets a little bit more complicated versus those single asset, small funds, friends and family rounds. Opportunity funds then have to make equity investments. That is in bold because it has to be an equity investment. This is not debt financing. You can't expect to invest into the fund and then to get your money back with a certain interest rate or into an operating business. You're entering that investment as an equity partner and a long-term partner at that too. You have to be committed to this. And that is where we run into some complications from this program. In real estate especially, 10 years is a long time to hold an investment. And certain investors are not thrilled with that requirement, but that's part of the policy here is to encourage long-term investment, no buying and flipping in zones, and entering and exiting within a year. Next slide, please, Tyler. So Florida's nomination process, as I mentioned previously, I was the policy director at DEO, the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, when opportunity zones were announced. So the governor had the authority to nominate zones. He turned to our office as the lead to handle that process for the state. So we led the selection process, me and my partner Aaron. And really we had a couple priorities when we were nominating these. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a flexible process. We could really implement and nominate them as however we saw fit. So some of these requirements were stuff that the state came up with in coordination with the governor's office. but we wanted to make sure that there was at least one in every county. Again, that wasn't required, but Governor Scott really wanted to prioritize and make sure that every single county in the state of Florida had the opportunity to use this program. From there, they were proportionately allocated. So larger counties had more zones. The county that had the most eligible zones got the most. So you have several counties, small counties, rural counties in the Panhandle that have one opportunity zone. And if you look at Miami-Dade County, you have 67 opportunity zones in that one county, which is more than several states. After that, to decide which zones were selected and which were not, if you recall, 25% we were allowed to select. So there was an economic analysis of poverty, unemployment, and population for these zones. Each zone looked drastically different. Just calling them low income is kind of a broad definition. Within that, you had zones, and really the main focus for Governor Scott was unemployment levels. For those of you that know, for 8 years, Governor Scott's kind of singular focus was job creation. So he was really looking at zones that had the highest unemployment rates and how could we designate tracts there. So, you know, if we're looking at 2 zones in a county and we're only allowed to pick one, and one of them has a 30% unemployment rate, which is true, and the zone next to it had a 10% unemployment rate, generally speaking, barring anything else, we'd selected a zone with higher unemployment because it seemed to us at the state that it needed more investment. There's more opportunities to create jobs there. The last step is really what made this a fun process. We took input from local governments, investors, businesses, elected officials, developers. For 1,700 eligible census tracts in the state, we had requests for over 1,200 individual tracts, and we were allowed to choose 427. So then it became a real balancing act between input that we got and the analysis. But I will say, 9 times out of 10, we deferred to the local government. We at the state level saw local government as the real boots on the ground in economic development. So anytime that they prioritize, this is the census tract we really care about, this is part of our strategic plan, we have ongoing investments, or we have property there, we have plans for whatever they had, if they reached out to the state and said, this is the one we want, as long as it was an eligible tract, that's generally the one that we chose. But again, it had to balance with the economic analysis. Next slide, please. So this is where it left us today. As you can see, the green on that map is Florida's opportunity zones, are Florida's opportunity zones. As I mentioned, the county with the most opportunity zones, Miami-Dade, you can barely see any green down there, and there's 67 tracts. And that's because, as I mentioned, these are census tracts. So it's based on population density. So in the city of Miami, you may have a square block that's a census tract, and that's why you can't really see them on this map. Versus, you know, Charlotte County, 2/3 of the county is covered. That's one large census tract there because the population is so spread out. And a lot of the Panhandle counties the same way, Calhoun and Liberty, Gulf County. So we have 427 zones, almost 2 million residents, 1 million jobs located in those zones, and 83,000 individual businesses located in those zones. Next slide, please. Our OZ statistics, I think this is so Florida's opportunity zone statistics. On the top line there, you have the state of Florida average for all of those indicators, and on the bottom are opportunity zones, the average across Florida's opportunity zones. So this is really telling. If you look at poverty rate, Florida's poverty rate is around 15%. In our opportunity zones, it's 30%, nearly double the state average. Median income is nearly half the state average. Bachelor's degrees is half the state average. Adults not working up 11%. Rent burden is higher. Minority populations are higher. So this is really telling as to what the whole emphasis for this program was and why these zones need investment. Statistically speaking, they are worse off than other communities across the state. Next slide, please. These are just major cities with zones. The city of Miami, 28, city of Tampa, 24, Jacksonville, 21. Next slide. Some opportunity zone infrastructure showing, this is a slide we did for a formal presentation showing Seaport and airports across the state relative to opportunity zones, several located in zone, several located adjacent or close by, obviously big hubs for economic development, so trying to bring in infrastructure into the conversation. Next slide. OZ fund investment, this is self-reported as of right now per the legislation. There are no reporting requirements. This is singularly a relationship between an individual taxpayer and the IRS. Your opportunity fund is registered with the state. Investments and asset tests that you have to do is all to the IRS every 6 months. There's no other state or federal entity that's involved in this, so there are no reporting. So this is all voluntarily self-reported by some of the big opportunity funds that are out there. This was put together by the National Council of State Housing Agencies. As you can see, the majority of funds are interested in commercial real estate. That's getting the most attention right now. Some community development, housing type of programs, economic development, infrastructure, but really the primary focus is commercial real estate right now per the self-reporting funds. Next slide. At the federal level, things that are happening. One thing actually just getting some conversation today out of the Senate from Senator Scott is a bill that would allow for states to change their opportunity zone designations. That got a lot of attention. It was such a quick process. That whole nomination process I discussed earlier happened over the course of 3 months. There are things we didn't get right. There are states that didn't get things right. So he's proposing the ability for states to change those selections, and we will see how that goes. It's always interesting. We wouldn't add more zones, but you would basically give a community the opportunity to change a zone. So there's a lot happening. The final regulations finally came out. That was a long waiting process. You know, this got released December 2017. There was 2 sets of proposed regs, and final regs came out just recently, so, 2 years later. The White House Opportunity and Revitalization Council is really interesting. It's a group of 13 grant-making federal agencies. It's chaired by Secretary Ben Carson of HUD, and really what they're intended to do per executive order, look at existing federal programs and figure out how they can better align with Opportunity Zone. How can you have more targeted funding into Opportunity Zone? Not coming out and creating new grant programs, but just how do we change what we already have? So some of the small announcements we've seen, and for sake of time, I'll keep it quick, but like the EDA, they have 5 investment priorities, and one of them is now Opportunity Zones. So that allows for them, when they're matching grants to locals, they can actually go beyond their 50-50. They can go up to a higher match in certain Opportunity Zone projects. So you're seeing announcements like that from EDA, from HUD, from USDA, SBA. So a lot of good announcements coming out. Proposed reporting requirements has got a lot of attention. Several bills have been filed. A lot of people want these funds to report what they are investing in. Disaster Opportunity Zone Act, I'll have to check on where this is. I don't think it's made much traction, but it was jointly filed by Senator Rubio and Rick Scott, and it was to allow disaster-impacted areas to select more opportunity zones, but it hasn't made much traction. Next slide, please. So what we're proposing at the state level is really supporting communities with opportunity zones. So the state, as I mentioned, doesn't have an official role. What we see them as a supporting role, helping communities that have zones, market those zones, provide state resources, or in line with the White House initiative, how can states put down their program dollars and specifically target them into opportunity zones? I think currently in Governor DeSantis' budget for the state of Florida, he has $250,000 set aside for marketing opportunity zones for communities. So it's small things like that a state can do. EFI has already mentioned or already made public a website that they have that you can find locations. Opportunity zones is a filter on there. So that goes to creating state grant programs or better aligning state grant programs. Using HUD CDBG dollars, states have a lot of control over how those dollars are implemented, letting those go towards communities to help do some strategic planning around their opportunity zones. Layering OZ data, we're already starting to see some of that, as I mentioned with the EFI, and then really just serving as a resource for communities. The state, for a long time after we left, had no point person at DEO for opportunity zones or at a state level. Nobody really knew anything about them. I believe DEO recently did someone to head that up. So just having someone at a state level that you can call and ask questions and be a free resource to communities is very helpful. Next slide. I'll run through very quickly some great examples of states and communities that have done a good job at this. Colorado's really leading the way across the country. They created a statewide office of opportunity zones and hired staff and have a director. And really it's to do what we're talking about. They did put out technical support grants for communities, and they put up an opportunity zone map. Next slide. And some guidance that they have on their website. This is all screenshots from Colorado's website, so guidance for communities. Next slide. Alabama is probably up there with Colorado, maybe even ahead, but it's interesting because it's not a state initiative really. It's actually a nonprofit. Opportunity Alabama is a nonprofit that is kind of taking over the opportunity zone duties on behalf of the state. They've worked well with the state. I don't know the official way that they've worked this out, but Opportunity Alabama is grant funded, and they provide support to opportunity zone communities as we do in Florida, but they're able to do it as a nonprofit for free to communities across Alabama because they are funded by some large grants. So they've had really interesting work come out of Alabama. Some of the best examples across the country have come out of that state, which is also a great opportunity for Alabama. Next slide. This is another a screenshot from their website, some of the featured zones they're showing in Birmingham, Mobile, Montgomery, and you can actually go to their website, see for investors, see certain projects in those cities. Next slide. So the community role, this is where we come in. This is our focus as we consult with local governments, with chambers, with cities and counties. If you have an opportunity zone, the starting point is to create an opportunity zone prospectus, and this is really an investment tool. It's a tool, it's a marketing tool for your zones to show, hey, we're X community, we're Tallahassee. Tallahassee came out with a prospectus. We're Tallahassee. We have 8 zones. Here's some of the big assets that we have. We have FSU. We have FAMU. We have state government, great city government. We have all of this stuff in our city and in these zones. Here's why investing in our community is a great fit and a great idea for you. Here's some of the other large-scale projects that are coming down the pipeline. So nobody likes to invest where no one's investing. You want to invest where some other activity is going on. And then reviewing zoning and permitting is important, too, as you look at some of these zones. What can you even do with these zones? Are they just zoned purely single-family residential, and then they're not providing as much opportunity? Or can we rezone some of those for mixed use, for multifamily, and allow for apartments or allow for affordable housing, which is getting a lot of attention? But reviewing that, reviewing permitting processes, that's another way. This whole program, if I can sum it up, is a cherry on top. The kind of cliche in this industry is that opportunity zones don't make a bad deal good, but they make a good deal great. So it really has to be a deal that stands on its own 2 feet already. But there are other things that a community can do to sweeten the pot and say, yes, we already have this great project, but it's in an opportunity zone, so you're going to get tax benefits for investing in it, and we're also going to expedite permitting for this project because we're prioritizing our zones. And then identifying publicly owned property is really interesting as well, city-owned property that they're willing to contribute to an affordable housing developer or something like that. Next slide. I'll breeze through these, just some communities with great examples. Next slide. Erie, Pennsylvania is kind of leading the way as far as cities go. They created Pennsylvania's flagship opportunity zone. I love this so much because this is the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, and they did not ask permission to the state of Pennsylvania to create Pennsylvania's flagship opportunity zone. They just bought the branding. They took it. They bought the website. They just they started a Twitter and a LinkedIn, and they just owned it. So they beat Pittsburgh to the punch. They beat Philly to the punch. And now Erie, the small town of Erie, Pennsylvania, has the flagship opportunity zone, and everything they're branded, you know, they even this is the screenshot from their website, and Erie's only mentioned on their one. It just says flagship opportunity zone real large in the corner, and Pennsylvania is flagship. So I just love what they did, and we've had the chance to talk with them. And we asked them, you know, what was their secret, and they just said they didn't ask for permission, which I thought was great, you know. Communities just, a lot of communities waiting for the state to do something or the state to lead initiative. Well, some states weren't very proactive, and to be honest, Florida wasn't very proactive. We're finally starting to come around, but, you know, now 2 years after the program was announced. So really communities have to take the lead and be the boots on the ground and fight for their community. Next slide. So again, that just kind of highlighting that they've gotten a lot of national attention. This is a tweet from Bruce Katz. that Twitter, yeah. And just showing that they're branding again. Next slide. Again, screenshots from their prospectus showing other investments ongoing in the community, public investments. Next slide. These are kind of the makings of a prospectus, that tool that I mentioned that communities should implement and should create for their communities. So this is showing specific strategies for different neighborhoods in their opportunity zones, having a plan for those neighborhoods and having a vision for them.
I'm Miles Bellog. I'm with Cardno, and I'm here with Amy Worsham. I'll do a brief introduction and then throw it over to Rick to do an introduction in the St. Pete office. I'm a senior principal and Brownfield practice leader in our Clearwater office. I'm a Brownfield practitioner for the last 25 years in state and federal Brownfield programs. Amy?
I'm Amy Worsham. Up there it says Amy Long, but that's my maiden name. We didn't catch that. I'm an environmental consultant and planner for Cardno.
Good afternoon. I'm Rick Hagberg. I'm a senior principal with Cardno, work out of the Clearwater office and support our statewide and southeast Brownfield redevelopment initiatives. I've got over 35 plus years experience and have been working in the Brownfield and redevelopment arena for over 20 years and work with our other Brownfield practitioners throughout the southeast.
Next slide, please. So we'd like to start a little bit about the philosophy and kind of the power of Brownfields. David Lloyd, who's the lead of the EPA Brownfield program and also a good friend, kind of describes it from a different perspective than you usually hear from EPA, because EPA usually is regulatory driven, but over the years, EPA's put millions of dollars into the federal Brownfield program. And he talks about it being an innovative approach to environmental protection, spurring environmental cleanup, reducing neighborhood blight, preserving green space, leveraging private sector investment, leveraging jobs and cleanup and redevelopment activities, and promoting community revitalization. I think it's important that we have a federal agency that usually does regulation that really is using redevelopment to make positive changes. And I have I'll paraphrase in the interest of time, my statement below. I look at Brownfields as really a way to transform properties that have an environmental legacy and turn them into things that are better for the community. I've done a lot of work over the last 25 years in implementing environmental justice in underserved communities and also trying to work on equitable redevelopment where the community is at the table. Obviously, Brownfields is much broader than that and can be used on many levels, but I think the community-based level is extremely important to talk about at the very beginning. There's two definitions here. I'm not going to read them, but basically the EPA – next slide, please. I'm looking at when I get done with the print. The EPA really talks about Brownfields as being real property that has some type of environmental issue. But the important thing to look at is either the presence or potential presence. And they have that in common with the state, because the state says it's properties where they're stigmatized from either actual or perceived contamination. So a lot of times we deal with properties that 1/3 of the properties may only require phase 1 environmental assessment, 1/3 might require soil and groundwater remediation, 1/3 might require total remediation. So it doesn't mean that you actually have to have a contaminated property. It means that you have the perception. The Brownfield area and local governments are on the line and at the table here in West Palm is really designated by the local government, and basically it can include one or more Brownfield sites that may or may not be contaminated. And really, when this was originally set up in the state statute, it was really to promote economic development in areas that were overburdened with environmental challenges. So I'm going to take you on a little tour, next slide please, of the kind of what we do in the field, give you an idea of some of the Brownfield sites that we work on real quickly. We deal with a lot of sites that have solvents, printers, dry cleaners, some in the state cleanup program, some not in the state cleanup program, and automotive repair. Next slide please. Here's some other lovely sites. One on the left-hand side was in the middle of Clearwater, Florida. It's now gone, and that site's ready for redevelopment. The other site on the right-hand side was Adams Volkswagen in Northwood, which was in Palm Beach County, and that site's been remediated and is ready for redevelopment as well. So we look at a lot of junkyards and salvage yards for redevelopment. Next slide, please. Also have a legacy of sites that have hazardous substance and hazardous waste, and we come in and try to come up with cost-effective ways to redevelop these, bringing some of the incentives that we'll talk about. Amy's going to go over the state Brownfield program in a minute. Next slide, please. We also have run into quite a few hospitals, some out in the Everglades, that may have even had some paranormal activity. They're pretty spooky. And then there's also a lot of schools throughout, not only throughout Florida, but throughout the nation that were developed due to segregation, and now they're ready for redevelopment. And we've looked at some of those. They provide promising redevelopment opportunities. And I do want to mention the sign on the left where it says asbestos. We do deal with a lot of issues with federal Brownfield grants dealing with buildings and asbestos and lead-based paint. Next, please. And while Florida doesn't have as many industrial sites as the Northeast or the Midwest, we have our share, and many of these have been redeveloped for successful Brownfield projects, and we'll talk about some successes later. Next, please. And this one's kind of unexpected. This is the Bartow cigar factory. And this site had soil contamination out on the grounds of the cigar factory, but it also had lead-based paint, asbestos, indoor air quality, and bird guano in it. And basically, we used an EPA Brownfield remediation grant to make this site ready for redevelopment. I think it would make a really nice microbrewery myself. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit more about the importance of local government and from a development perspective, there's over 30 financial and regulatory incentives that the local government can offer. They're not funded, but if you're taking a Brownfield project for redevelopment to a local government, it's a good wish list to go down to see if they can contribute. They can do tax increment financing through the CRAs. There's a way to do waiver of transportation impact fees and permit fees and market projects, just to name a few. And the local government can really be key to make projects feasible. So what we try to do with our practice is remove environmental stigma from properties, support job creation within communities, and also convert sites that are basically lying fallow into something that will generate revenue. We've done a lot of work with affordable housing developers who are actually looking for Brownfield sites. We make sure that they're safe and approved by DEP for residential use. We also do a lot of risk management. We look at using engineering and institutional controls on sites. We have a health field practice where we're actually trying to take sites in underserved communities where they don't have access to things like health care and fresh food or open space, green space, and transform Brownfield sites into that. And when we're talking to city managers and CRA directors, and I think there's CRA directors at the table here, we're always talking about trying to return these properties to the tax rolls. And that benefits the entire community as well. Next, please. Okay. So who are our typical Brownfield stakeholders? Well, I did want to thank Louis Lawman for welcoming us and hosting today. We deal with a lot of attorneys that kind of the glue that hold the projects together. We deal with a lot of local governments to bring them grant funding and to bring them the type of redevelopment that's desired. We work with many communities that have had a lot of environmental injustice, and we try to use Brownfields to remove contamination and provide end uses that are greatly needed. A lot of things that people may take for granted in their community, a lot of people don't have, like a grocery store, for example. We work with economic development agencies, and we work with regional planning councils. And I have Stephanie Height is sitting next to me with Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. The thing about the regional planning councils is they have about over $2 million worth of money for cleanup right now in hand for low-interest loans, Brownfield Cleanup Revolving Loan Funds. So they're good people to talk to. We deal with developers who bring the capital to the table, and development authorities, real estate investment trusts, Nonprofits have a new role with the EPA grants now that they can be eligible for not only cleanup grants but also assessment grants. And we work closely with attorneys to make the banks feel comfortable with lending on brownfield sites. Next. Some of the new trends that we see, we have a lot of projects that are sustainable and green development. In Palmetto, Florida, they're doing a lot of stormwater conversion projects where they're actually integrating brownfield sites, cleaning them up and cleaning up the water that goes into the Manatee River. Repowering America's lands, we're seeing a lot of renewable energy on brownfield sites, and the Lake Worth landfill has got a solar array on it now. Healthfield redevelopment that I alluded to earlier, where we're bringing healthcare, open space, green space, and fresh food to underserved communities. And petroleum brownfield initiatives, because if you look at any major corridor, just about every intersection has either an active gas station site or an old gas station site that requires redevelopment for something better than an abandoned gas station site for sure. And Gray was talking about the interagency working group, and we do that in the brownfield arena as well, where we're working not only with EPA, but with HUD and EDA and the Stormwater Revolving Loan Fund to leverage opportunities. And of course, today we're talking about the opportunity zones, which we feel is like the next big catalytic opportunity. So now I'd like to turn it over to Amy. Next slide, please. And Amy will go over the state brownfield assessment and cleanup process.
Okay, thank you, Miles. So one of the things that really confuses people a lot of times with brownfields is that there's both a state program and a federal program. And to really get the best benefit is to combine both programs. So I'm going to try and keep them separate, and I'm going to start with the state program. Real quick, I'm going to touch on the process for those of you who are not, don't know the due diligence process. So first, we start with a Phase 1 environmental site assessment, normally called Phase 1 ESA. With that, it's really, really important to get that done, even if property is being donated to you, because without that, it precludes you from grants and a lot of other incentives. So very important. It's an inexpensive report, very important for your liability. Next, first with Phase 1, it's just a desktop review. We look at historical aerials, what's happened at the site before, with historic pesticide use, tanks in the ground, stuff like that. We do a site visit as well. But the next phase is the Phase 2 environmental site assessment. We go out if we think something was maybe dumped at the site or placed on the site that could have caused environmental contamination. We call them recognized environmental conditions. We go out and test the site. So that can be surface water, groundwater, soil, asbestos, lead-based paint, mold, and air quality are the most typical ones. Hopefully, we find nothing and you can move forward with your development. But if we do find something, then we move on to cleanup planning. Cleanup planning, we can do traditional removing tanks, removing soil, or adding clean soil on top 2 feet. Sometimes we use the building slab or parking lots as engineering controls. There's a lot of different ways around it, and it really depends on your timeline for development and funds available. That's the path forward. So then we go through the plan approvals. Leveraging this whole time, we're going to be leveraging additional funds, both for the environment, but also for your construction, and even things like programming for the site. If you want to bring in a job incubator, stuff like that, this whole time you can be looking for those funds as well. Then we can go to the next slide. Okay, so for the state program, there's the targeted brownfields assessment, and that is through DEP. They have a pot of funds each year, and they can spend money on sites up to $100,000. Basically, you just put in a short application. We can assist you with that to get funds for that, for assessment and remediation. Then there's the additional state program, and that's when you start getting into the brownfield areas and brownfield sites. And this is what Miles touched on before. Can you just skip to the next slide real quick? Okay. So we're in West Palm, so here's a little image of West Palm. So Miles mentioned that a lot of communities created these brownfield areas for economic development. So if you can see the purple, those are brownfield areas. So these are created by resolution through the local government. It can be led by the local government, but if a developer comes in and wants to become a brownfield area, they can initiate it themselves. And And it's important to do it by the end of the calendar year for the same year that you are incurring assessment and remediation costs. So once you are in a brownfield area, then you're eligible to become a brownfield site through the state. That's when you enter into a brownfield site rehabilitation agreement, more commonly just referred to as BSRA. If you want to go back one slide. Okay. So on the second one, on the second bullet, the state loan guarantees, if you're in a brownfield area, you are eligible for these. These aren't used as often, but when banks were uncertain about loaning to properties with environmental issues, this was more popular. Now banks are a little bit more comfortable. There's just not as many pieces of property that don't have issues anymore. Next are sites that have a BSRA or abut a site with a BSRA. The job bonus tax refund is really popular for really big entities such as Walmart, Publix, IKEA. Those are the types of people who typically go after that. They can get $2,500 per job that they create, and it's full-time equivalent, so the part-time jobs they can add up. And then if you do some affordable housing, then you can also get a 25%, or sorry, excuse me, not a 25%. It's a tax refund on the building materials. So that's really good for affordable housing projects. Next slide. Okay, so this is what we just already whenever we go to the next slide now. Okay, so additional incentives for sites with the BSRA. There's a certain regulatory framework that it's a little bit more flexible, so that is a big incentive for some people. It's a risk-based corrective action. That's when we get into a lot of the engineering controls, and it's a little bit more flexible, and DEP will typically move through the process faster. Also, there's 2 counties that are delegated, so you work directly with them. The top 2 things that people go after for the Brownfield Site Rehabilitation Agreement, one is the liability protection. So obviously a lot of the attorneys in the room, that's big for you guys. But also the voluntary cleanup tax credits. It's really important for a lot of the developers. Those are given back, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them on the next slide, but those are given back as Florida corporate income tax. And some people can't use those, or government agencies don't really have a need for those. So what we do is we have a group of brokers, and the tax credits can be transferred to them, and then they sell them. So they basically package them together and sell them to large corporations. And those typically get brokered about 87 cents to 92 cents on the dollar. So the amount this looks really complicated, but if you just look at the last column, it's the costs incurred and paid after 2007. So let's say you have a $2 million cleanup. Each year you can max out for assessment and remediation costs, and that also includes your legal fees as well. So let's say we have a $2 million cleanup. A lot of times we don't get that expensive, but to keep the math simple. So you can max out $500,000 at the 50% for the first year. So what we would recommend is if you spend $1 million the first year, you can claim that 50%, get that $500,000. Then the next year you can reapply. You have to apply by January, end of January each year for the calendar year prior cost. So then after 2 years you have applied for $2 million. Then you get $1 million back. And then when you close out the site, you get a no further action letter or a site rehabilitation completion order. Then for all costs incurred over all years, you apply and get another 25%. So now you're at 75%. You get $1.5 million back. If you do affordable housing or healthcare, then you can get an additional 25%. Next slide. Can you actually go one more slide? Okay. So before I pass it to Rick, I'm going to real quick go over the EPA Federal Grants. So those were the state programs, and then the grants are eligible for municipalities and nonprofits. But developers and all entities can basically take advantage of the grants once they are awarded to a municipality. So like the Regional Planning Council, they have funds, and developers can come in and access those funds. They're looking for projects that are going to promote economic development. So the different grants that there are, and these go in every year in the fall, typically in November or December when grant applications go in, and then the funds are awarded. It's a highly competitive process. So we find out in June, May, June, and then the funds come in October 1st, or that's when you can start spending. So there's the community-wide assessment grants. Those do the phase 1 and phase 2s, but you can also do a lot of community planning with them. We've done conceptual site designs. Those are really big for developers and helping move sites that are really stagnant, or if they have like a really weird, we've had property that was in the shape of a triangle that no one wanted to to buy. So that was really helpful for that property. If you do find issues with the site, you can go after cleanup grants. It's $500,000. You do need to do a cost share of 20% on those, and you have to own the site. Then there's coalition assessment grant. That's what typically the regional planning councils or large counties go after. They basically come in together as a coalition and go in as a team. There's also multi-purpose grants. Those are the most competitive right now, but you can apply for both assessment and remediation dollars at the same time. Revolving loan funds, those, again, typically go for the larger entities like regional planning councils or large counties, and they can provide low-interest loans to developers to move forward with the remediation. And then the job training grants. Those typically are like universities provide job training in the environmental field. So with that was a real quick, I was trying to make up some time but if you guys have any questions, Rick is going to go over some of the success stories we've had with some of our projects.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Amy. So just to kind of follow up with, so how do we actually, implement all these different tools that Miles and Amy were talking about? This is a site in the village of North Palm Beach. The Seacoast Utilities used to operate an old wastewater plant on this site for about 50 years. And to upgrade this facility to the current criteria to get, the appropriate discharge criteria, they determined it was too much money to upgrade the plant. So out of the goodness of their heart, they gave it to the city of the village of North Palm Beach. Well, this site had a lot of issues. So it had multiple former wastewater plant buildings and facilities and tanks. They had underground storage tanks. They used the site as a dredge disposal site at one point in time when they dredged the adjacent Ermine River. Had asbestos all over the place and all the old buildings and pipes and whatnot. And so we're able to help the village of North Palm Beach along with Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council and got the village all different types of grants. They also got some appropriations. And so what we did was we were able to demo all the old structures, remove all the old tanks, and Cardinal actually designed this really nice playground facility, upgraded the boat ramp. We enhanced the existing waterfront amenities with a new marina and dog park and boardwalks and some vista overview areas. So that really turned out to be quite an impressive site, and we used about 7 different types of funding sources from various local and state governmental agencies to help support this project. Next slide, please. This is a site down in Bradenton, Robinson Preserve. It was an existing passive park facility that the Robinson family wanted to give some additional property to the county to expand the park. It was an old historical agricultural facility. We went out and did phase 1 and phase 2. We used money through the Sarasota Manatee County MPO that got a $1 million coalition grant, and we were able to use not only both private and federal funding to help assess and then help the city to redevelop this park. And the results are they've got a state-of-the-art environmental education center. We expanded a bunch of the ecological amenities and also expanded both passive and active park elements, canoe launch, paddle trail, and a walking and jogging trail. So this was a very sort of unique application of Brownfield monies to help support open space, green space, which is one of the key components of the Brownfield program. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite projects. This is here in St. Pete Beach. This used to be the former Meisner Marine Construction Headquarters. It was also the City of St. Pete Beach's Municipal Center. We found soil and groundwater contamination at this site during the Phase 1 and Phase 2 due diligence activities, and we were also able to uniquely go after a variety of different brownfield funding sources to help this. We got money directly from FDEP for that targeted brownfield assessment, the TBA. They also did a small dirt removal, and Cardinal actually designed this park also. And one of the innovative things that we were able to come up with is that where the former underground storage tanks used to be associated with this marine construction facility, we actually removed all the tanks, contaminated soil, and then brought in a innovative stormwater management system to help address some of the downtown flooding issues and also improve water quality, because in the background you can see this is Bogosiega Bay, which is an impaired water body. And so we actually improved the water quality from part of the downtown area around St. Pete Beach, brought it through the park, and then actually used some of those stormwater design aspects and turned that into an amenity for the park. And then you can see there's a new pool, there's a new library, and then kiddie playground. You can see the Bogosiega Bay there and the bridge in the background. So this was a very unique project where we brought in, and we also got funding from the Water Management District to actually design and then construct that stormwater management system. So a lot of different funding sources at play that sort of demonstrates how you can leverage all these different funding sources to really bring some additional funds to bear on the project, and certainly the Brownfield process helped bring all that together. Next slide, please. This is an interesting project. This is, you saw an earlier slide that showed part of this site. This is now the Seaport Town Center, which is a 400-unit mixed-use project in downtown Tampa, right near Channelside, which is where the cruise terminal is, and right adjacent to Ybor City. This used to be the city's former fleet maintenance facility, so it had about 14 underground storage tanks. Little did we know, but back in the 20s, there used to be an old wastewater treatment plant on this site also that they demoed and just backfilled it with a bunch of dirt and then built a building over the top of it. So as we began our assessment, we kept encountering all this unusual stuff underground, and we went back and determined that there was an old wastewater plant there, and all that had to be excavated and removed, all the sludges. They had soil and groundwater contamination issues. Groundwater impacts had migrated off-site, so we had off-site groundwater issues to address. It was kind of a unique public-private partnership between the city of Tampa and the developer, and they used a variety of different types of brownfield funding for this. Early on, they had one of the very first targeted brownfield assessment grants, and we also were able to use that money plus targeted brownfield assessment through FDEP. And then what was the real benefit is that they took advantage of over about $2.2 million worth of the voluntary cleanup tax credits back to the project over about a 3 or 4 year period, because this was quite an extensive remediation project. And so it's one of the highlights of the new downtown redevelopment area right around Channelside. And this was a catalyst for some of that early development. This project's been out of the ground now for probably about, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years. So it was at the very beginning of the renaissance of that portion of downtown Tampa. Next slide, please. This site's over in Cocoa, the city of Cocoa Beach. This was an old historic post office site that had all different types of crazy historical uses, dry cleaners, adjacent railroads, pesticides, herbicides, print shops, on-site underground storage tanks. And so the city of Cocoa, we actually wrote those folks a couple of grants, and they used their EPA assessment funding to do phase 1, phase 2, asbestos testing, and we were able to help the city redevelop this old antique post office into their new city municipal services building, which is the city hall, emergency operations, billing departments, et cetera. And this site's also a LEED Silver certified building, which is a really nice reuse as compared to that old relic-looking building there at the top of that slide. So this was a project that really, I think, took full advantage of the various brownfield opportunities, and the city, you know, developed this beautiful new building in place of that old post office site. Next slide, please. All right, I think I'll turn it back over to Amy on this one.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, so the reason we got together today was kind of to talk about opportunity zones and brownfields, and they can definitely be used in collaboration with each other. With the EPA grants, we typically go after communities that need help kind of spurring economic development, and right now, buzzword with that is opportunity zones. So we're looking for more projects that can both take advantage of the incentives that are already there for brownfields, and then also now put them into the opportunity zone incentives. So what can we do for you? This is kind of a little bit just about Cardno. We're a full-service engineering firm for redevelopment space. We do civil, we do seawalls, a lot of different stuff, obviously environmental, planning, real estate, and site development. So for the grants, what we have secured for communities, we have done $24.2 million in EPA grant funds for 63 communities with 68 grants. $24 million, and that's just the last 5 years. We have a proven track record in going after grants, and hopefully we can help some of your communities access these grants.